Christian County Library presents an author talk with Dr. Holly Holladay, Assistant Professor of Media Theory and Criticism at Missouri State University. Today, we'll discuss the portrayal of American politics and its impact on digital fandom via Dr. Holladay's new book about the television show Parks and Recreation. The way we access and engage with television has changed with the advent of streaming and the level of interaction viewers have with their favorite shows. In her book, Dr. Holladay discusses how Parks and Recreation works as a sitcom, the fan culture it helped to create, its portrayal of politics during the Obama administration, and how the show grapples with race and gender. All right, so thank you for joining us today, Dr. Holladay, and we'll just go ahead and get started with our questions about your book.
Very cool.
So first I was wondering, when I was reading through the book, in what ways does Parks and Recreation constitute a cultural forum the way traditional sitcoms did in the past? I'm thinking like All in the Family and things like that that really have things to say about the moment.
Well, it's interesting because we have to start with to do the briefest conversation about television history. At one time, as we know, there were three channels, ABC, NBC, and CBS, and they commanded the entire audience. And inherent in the term broadcast networks is the word broad, right? Like you're trying to reach the broadest, most heterogeneous audience possible. And so what that usually meant was content that was deemed inoffensive, however you want to take that. That can mean lots of different things, but anything that would just be a little bit bland that could appeal to everybody in terms of situation or lifestyle or political ideologies or whatever. And so now we live in a media landscape that is incredibly niche. And so even if we think about, my students often remind me that 25 years ago was quite a long time ago, and most of them weren't alive then. But to me, it doesn't feel that long ago that Seinfeld, which I was a big fan of, speaking sort of culturally, a television show that's really culturally significant. In 1998, when the finale aired, 76 million people watched that.
Wow.
And yeah, it was pretty significant. And
76
now
million people?
76 million. And then like the I Love Lucy episode where Lucy gives birth, I mean, we're talking like 140 or something, like a monstrous number. Most every single was like 76% or something. I did say 76 again, so maybe that's not correct. But it's huge because there's not that many options. When we get to Seinfeld, there's more options and you see those numbers decrease. But even then, I mean, it was massive numbers. And so I remember when I first started teaching media analysis, television analysis, The Walking Dead was really popular. And The Walking Dead was getting around 11 million viewers. And again, it was sort of conceived as being this ratings juggernaut, especially for cable television. And so I say all of this to say, when we think about what a cultural forum is and what sort of possibilities television programs have and what they can do, we have to automatically start from the assumption that what broadcast means in 2009 to 2015 is when Parks was on the air, means something so different than it meant in the 70s when this sort of idea of a television as a cultural form was first developed. And so I say that because Parks has a really big challenge. It's a broadcast sitcom that is trying to appeal to as wide of an audience as it can, whereas you've got these other really niche specific cable sitcoms, streaming sitcoms that can really go all in on like a particular point of view. And so the way that it operates as a cultural form, I don't even know that I would say it does. I think it comes as close as we possibly can get in 2023 with our television landscape, in that it's offering really day to day, here's what's going on and here's how we can make sense of politics and culture and the world around us through the lens of these really sort of funny characters and offer commentary. And I know we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it sort of the argument that sort of theoretically that I'm drawing from in the book is, how do we determine what is good TV, quality TV, phenomenal television, or whatever in like our current media landscape? And it's difficult, and it's because it is so vast. So that was a long way to say, I think it has something to offer in terms of how we understand ourselves in the same way that a lot of those traditional broadcast sitcoms did.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Clearly, also as I was going through your book, you do break that down and how it does kind of reflect our time or our lives at the time, 2009 to 2015, our present kind of political landscape, everything like that. So you kind of were talking there about television history, um,
Yeah.
and specifically the sitcom. So how would you say Parks engages with like the traditional sitcom structure? Does it evolve the sitcom forward from, like you said, those very broad early days to kind of the incredibly niche market that we're in now?
I'm really protective of sitcoms. I think if you ask people about the television that they watch, we have moved past the idea that like watching television is like, the boob tube or like is gonna rot your brain or the Great West Wait,
Yes.
or whatever. But I think that two genres on the whole that people will universally disparage and dismiss are number one, reality television, which I also love, and number two, sitcoms. And when they say that, they are talking a lot about the assumptions we make about formula, format, storytelling style, and et cetera, in traditional sitcoms. And so just to give you like the briefest primer on a couple different kinds, and it's difficult, we can't like discreetly say, okay, this is this kind and this is this kind, because they meld and they share, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. They share
Sure.
all of these different characteristics. But basically you have two broad styles: the multi-camera sitcom, which is what we think of in terms of traditional sitcom. So it's set up like on a stage and they're performing. It's the laugh track. It's the much more physical comedy. It's that sort of and obviously most popular examples we've already talked about: Seinfeld, but also Friends, The Cosby Show. Basically everything, not exclusively, but everything pre 21st century
Yeah.
was working from that style. And so the other style is single camera sitcom, which is a bit of a misnomer because they do use multiple cameras, but we just call it the single camera style. And that is what we have come to associate with like quality sitcoms. So
Mm.
and Parks being one of those. But it also borrows a lot from the traditional sitcom in that physical comedy at times is really, really significant in Parks. And Andy Dwyer, Chris Pratt's character in particular, Ron Swanson has great bits of physical comedy in there. So it's not discreet, but obviously we tend to think of modern sitcoms as those single cam without the laugh track. In particular, Parks is a mockumentary style, which
Mm.
anybody who watches The Office, Abbott Elementary has sort of
Got
brought
it.
that back. It's really lovely, but it's unfolding as if it is a documentary crew, and a documentary crew is capturing what's on screen,
Mm.
and then it's punctuated by those talking head interviews. And
Yeah.
so it gives us some extra layers of insight to the things that are happening, but it's set up as if we're just watching all of this unfold. And then we get we're not privy to the questions that they're asked, but we get that extra insight
Mm.
that they are able to provide in those talking head interviews. And so when we think about mockumentary style, it is something that, we liked in the United States. I think The Office was like the first real like shaky cam situation that we are familiar with. Mockumentary and single cam aren't interchangeable. Mockumentary is a type of single cam. So if you think about like Arrested Development and Scrubs and like anything without a laugh track,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
those are still single cam. They're just a little bit different in terms of like use archival footage. And in Scrubs, we were always like in the head of JD, the protagonist, and like all of his like
Right.
wild and wacky ideas that he had going on. But basically, I would say partly it does borrow from traditional sitcom formats, but has evolved in the way that it made a name for itself. And it really fits within that. Like if we think mockumentary and you're having to make like your top 5 mockumentary sitcoms of whatever era, I mean, Parks
Sure.
is very much a part of that, and made that, gave it sort of a name to that style in terms of sitcoms.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting because you're right. I mean, there was definitely a like an insurgence, I don't know, of that format
Yeah.
I hadn't seen before. It became very popular. I remember loving Modern Family, and it
Oh
had
yeah, another great
the
example.
same yeah, format there. So
Absolutely.
okay, so also in terms specifically of Parks, so in your book you discuss the idea of paratexts. point out that most current TV engages in multiple conversations with their audience. It's not just about sitting down
Yeah.
and watching the show itself. So, how has Parks, in your experience, been utilized in this way by viewers? And then, has the show itself, did the show engage with paratexts to like create more success for itself, basically?
Yeah. That's a great question to give everybody a quick
Mhm.
definition of what paratexts are. Really
Yes.
anything that circulates around the show itself. So the show itself is a text. And so paratexts are not new to like the era of Parks. If you think about interviews with the cast in the newspaper,
Mhm.
talking about the upcoming season, that's a paratext. If you think about the DVD extras that have long existed, whenever you rent it or you buy DVDs or whatever, that's also paratext. What's so interesting now, so it's anything that like is different from the show, but is related to the show and gives meaning to it and like helps influence our meaning. So a really good example of this is, I don't know if anyone watching is a fan of Gilmore Girls,
Mhm.
but I read an article once after the show had concluded, and this might just be rumor, I might just be perpetuating a rumor here, but read that the actors who played the main couple, Luke and Lorelai, so Lauren Graham and Scott Patterson, like actually didn't like each other in real life.
Oh,
And so that is a wonderful example. It's just an article I read, like in People magazine or whatever, but
yeah.
it's paratext that influences how I watch the show, because now when I go back, I'm like, oh, these actors, even though they're in a relationship, kind of hated each other, and that
Yeah.
impacts. So that's a paratext, anything that like,
Okay.
circulates around and gives meaning. So related to Parks, and one of the arguments I make in the book is that it coincides with social media and the ubiquity of social media. So we're running 2009 to 2015. Obviously, Facebook launches. Mark Zuckerberg and I are the same age, and I always like to tell my students that, like, we were both born in 1984. So social media obviously has been developing through the 90s and early 2000s, but like in 2009, from 2009 to 2015, we're talking about like an explosion of users and different uses for it. So I think that's partly what makes television of that era distinct, because you can be on YouTube like remixing your favorite scenes from Parks and like recutting them in different ways, and that becomes like a paratext that
Oh,
influences
yeah.
how you might enjoy the show. You've got like this like super cut of Andy and April's most romantic moments or whatever. Um, and the thing about social media is not only are the digital tools there to do that stuff easily, but you can easily disseminate it, share it on Facebook or Tumblr or Reddit, and write fan fiction and those types of things.
Yeah.
It used to be much more difficult to do that. Last thing I'll say about that is what makes Parks unique, and this is probably less of a paratext, though it has generated paratexts. There's two accidental holidays that have come out of Parks and Rec.
Mhm.
And this is something that I imagine some people, I kind of hope that there's somebody watches this and they didn't really know this was the origin of what I'm about to say.
Mhm.
But to a lesser extent, Treat Yourself Day. So if you've ever heard anybody say treat yourself, but especially in that way, comes from Parks and Rec. The official calendar day is October 13th. But more importantly, is Galentine's Day, or more robustly is Galentine's Day, which is February 13th and came from an episode of Parks and Rec. And I'm not saying that no one had ever used that term in the history of everyone
Right.
before, but it became popularized through Parks and Rec, and so many people don't know that. What I think is so cool about that is that every time that it's February 13th and you get together with your girlfriends and you have brunch and you like watch a movie or whatever, and you're having like posting on social media about Valentine's Day, you are you were either intentionally or unintentionally
Mm.
participating in Parks and Rec fandom, which is sort of a neat thing. And both of those things were really organic. They didn't do those on purpose. They were cool ideas that fans latched onto and really built traditions out of,
For
which
sure.
I think is super cool.
I haven't participated in the Treat Yourself Day specifically, but I say that frequently.
Yeah, yeah. Did you know it
So
came from Parks? Did you know
I
it came
did
from Parks?
not understand that it came directly from Parks. No, not in that way, like you said. So
Yeah,
it's pretty
yeah.
fascinating.
It is cool. It's really neat. And the episode itself, it appears in two different episodes, one toward the beginning of the series and one at the end. But they're really fun. And I mean, it's delightful to go and like look at hashtags when I was doing the research for the book and like see the way that it was very clear a lot of times, especially in the Valentine's Day posts, who was just using that hashtag because it's come to be its own thing now,
Right.
in which people were using it because they were directly fans of Parks. They would like quote one of the characters or whatever. So it's pretty cool.
Oh, sure.
Pretty neat. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so another question I had for you, as you point out in the book, Parks aired at the same time as the presidency of Barack Obama.
Mhm.
I think you pointed out that it did start a few months before he was elected, or
he was inaugurated in January of 2009, and it started in April 2009.
Oh,
So
okay, gotcha.
it was contained entirely with him. Yeah.
Okay, so for something like the show itself takes place obviously at like a local government institution, deals with those themes. What are some ways the show reflected real world politics at the time of its airing? And then do you think that the show in any way takes sides in terms of political parties, issues, debates? What's your view on that?
Yeah. Parks and sitcoms in general, this is not something, and the genre of television I think of doing it most are crime shows. But this idea of like ripped from the headlines ways to tell stories, fictionalized versions of real life events. And so I think about things like NCIS and Law and Order SVU or whatever. Like whenever you watch those episodes, most of the time it is like beat for beat something that's happened in real life, and they've built a story around it. That's obviously been the case with lots of other political shows. Lots of different narrative styles of media and television use that approach. So Parks is not unique in that, but I think what it was doing, there's some really, really clear examples of them taking things that are going on the macro United States political arena and then bringing them down to Pawnee and lampooning them a little bit and addressing them in sort of a funny way. And so the earliest one I remember is when the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, was being waged in sort of the Supreme Court about its constitutionality. There was an episode of Parks where Leslie married two penguins that happened to be male. And so she had a gay wedding for the penguins, and she's really, really celebrated at the gay club in Pawnee, and they have this big event in her honor. But there was a lot of sort of discourse about and lots of lines used in the episode from people who were opposed to her doing this very silly and adorable thing and saying she had an agenda behind it. Yeah, it was cool. And so they did that one. There was when there was all of the discourse about Barack Obama's birth certificate and whether or not he was an actual United States citizen. They brought that to Pawnee by having Leslie, who was very proud to be from Pawnee, that she was actually born in neighboring Eagleton, because when Leslie was born, the hospital was overrun with raccoons because there's like this reoccurring raccoon infestation in Pawnee. And so they really did some like funny stuff with that. Whenever there were all of the corporate, I wrote about this at length in the book, but were all of these corporate bailouts, the Pawnee government bailed out a video store that was like going under, and they turned it into an adult video store. And there's lots of like funny repercussions for that. So it's humorous. It's taking all of these things that are actually really serious and this goes back to your question about the cultural forum. Like it's giving us a way to engage with. And I think this is what comedy is so good about. Gives us a way to engage with all of these issues that are incredibly important, but allowing us to sort of look at the holes in the arguments, to be playful with some of the ideas. And so to answer the second part of your question about whether I think I think that Parks takes sides. This was a conversation I had when I was doing edits in the book, because I really tried to say, it is one of the arguments I make is about this concept called polysemy, that there are multiple meanings. Television is really, really rich with meanings. And a lot of the way that we make sense of it has to do with who we are as human beings and the experiences, perspectives, ideologies, et cetera, that we bring to make sense of it. And this is especially true in comedy, because comedy works in so many different layers. So the creator of Parks was very careful not to label Leslie a Democrat or Republican. He was really, really careful about that. until the final episode. And she is approached by the Democratic National Convention to run for a higher level office.
Gotcha.
But he said, he was really adamant about, like, a lot of times, like most city council elections, which is where where the sort of the level she was at for most of the show, they're not oftentimes are not partisan, should not be partisan, and you don't register as a Democrat, Republican, Independent to run for city council. So that was his argument there. I would say on the whole it's left leaning. I would say that in part because of who the demographic is watching it. It's primarily young people of a particular education background and financial sort of affluence that tend to vote in a particular way.
Sure.
But I think that Ron Swanson is one of the main characters. I was
just about to bring him up. Yeah.
Yeah, he's one of the main characters, and he is absurd. And he's a libertarian, he's an avowed libertarian, he is absurd. And a lot of the stuff that he does is absurd. But by the same token, Leslie Knope, who is, as we learn, a Democrat, is also absurd, and she does absurd things. And so part of the argument I make is, and they're both incredibly sympathetic, and truth be told, their relationship is really the emotional core of the show. It is a wonderful. So I think a lot of what Michael Schur, the creator, was advocating for was sort of a working together, a bipartisanship. I think it leans left, but I think it's also got more to say than that, especially if depending on where you're coming from with your ideology. I can imagine like my dad watching it, who is pretty libertarian, and taking something from Ron's character that I might not. So yeah,
that's a good point. And I think, I'm personally speaking, that just sounds really lovely to encourage working together and looking past labels like that. So you spoke a lot about Leslie. We haven't really spoken specifically about her yet, but as the main character, you point out in the book that she describes herself as a feminist. So how does her character, would you say, engage with previous pioneering women in television? So Mary Tyler Moore, Murphy Brown, even the Golden Girls,
Yeah, absolutely.
How does her character, engage with that?
Well, Leslie Knope doesn't exist without those characters, right? Like without those sort of forerunners of Murphy Brown, of Mary Tyler Moore, of Claire Huxtable, of all of these, all of these. We take, of course, Claire Huxtable is a little bit more complicated because that's a domestic sitcom, right? It's not specifically a workplace sitcom, but she had her own career and she was an attorney. And so one thing that I think is really interesting about that is that so many of our earliest representations of women are domestic. They're, they're in the domestic sphere. And we start to see in the 70s that shift a little bit. And like I said, that's kind of why I say that she doesn't exist without Murphy Brown and Mary Tyler Moore and all of those pioneering, as you mentioned, women, particularly because Leslie is first and foremost in her role, somebody who's incredibly competent, incredibly good at her job. And yes, things like, and this comes up over and over and over again, things like interpersonal relationships, things like having a romantic partner who she ends up having someone who's incredibly well matched for her, having children, which she eventually has triplets. Like all of those things are important to her, but first and foremost, we see her as this incredibly competent public servant. And so I think that's what's so cool. We're taking her out of the domestic sphere, and she's paying homage to those women who came before her. One lovely example that you see pop up a couple of times in Parks is she has a wall of inspirational women hanging in her office.
Yes.
And you see the first one, you see it for the first time, and it's political figures on both sides of the aisle. So it's Condoleezza Rice and also like Michelle Obama or whatever. And then whenever she becomes a city council herself, she takes all of those pictures and puts them in her office and puts a picture of herself up there with them.
Yeah.
She tells her partner, I'm not too big to admit that I'm often inspired by myself. So I put this up. And so it's really compelling to see those kind of examples. She's flawed. There are things she's overzealous in some ways and doesn't quite misses the mark in lots of ways. But I think she oftentimes is trying to advocate for women. There's this really great, when she gets on city council, there's this really great episode called Women in Garbage that I talk about in the book, where she sort of admonishes some of the departments in the city government for not hiring women. And they say, listen, sanitation is a really physical job. And so she and another female character go on the trash route to sort of prove that this is, and so in the end,
women
they
can
end
do
up,
it too. Yeah.
yeah, in the end, they end up hiring 3 women to add to the sanitation department. And there's lots of complexities to be explored there, but
Sure.
I think she was advocating, and she was a really significant mentor to the intern who April, played by Aubrey Plaza, who starts as the intern and sort of moves up through government herself. And so, yeah, I think that's drawing those connections between some of those older, more pioneering female characters and Leslie Knope is necessary for understanding her character.
Yeah, and it sounds like her character is definitely advocating for more.
Yeah.
Just within the universe of the show itself, but it sounds like it's, playing with or having a conversation with media as a whole and saying like, let's contribute and continue creating, great female roles and all of that.
Well, and Amy Poehler, who plays Leslie, has been a huge advocate for that, just in general. Mm-hmm.
That's cool. Okay, so lastly, I wanted to talk about the ways that Parks portrays like things like race in America, and then also particularly given its airing during the Obama administration.
Yeah. So like a lot of things during the Obama era, there was discourse about post-racialism, which or sort of colorblindness, which is in its simplest terms, this idea that, we've elected someone who is not white, who is Black as the most important, powerful person in the United States. Because of that must mean that we have moved past race as a culture, and it's no longer that significant because, right, like that, I mean, it's that,
like
that's
solved. Yeah.
Right. It's that logic of, so we were able to, he was elected to the highest, there's obviously it's much more complicated than that, but what that did, and this is not necessarily new, we start to see it a lot in the 1980s too, with the Cosby Show and this idea that race was not addressed, even though they were a Black family. And a lot of that is happening as well in television in that era that Parks aired. One really notable exception, I mean, there were a significant number of, I would say half of the main cast were people of color. Aziz Ansari. Yeah, Aziz Ansari, Retta, who plays Donna, Aubrey Plaza is of Puerto Rican descent, Rashida Jones is half Black. I mean, like it was a pretty multiracial cast, but it wasn't race itself in terms of like, we're going to talk about this, we're going to talk about sort of the impact this has on us as a character, was not addressed, except with one really notable exception, and that was the indigenous Wamapoke Native American tribe that lived there obviously before white settlers came and founded Pawnee. They have a really interesting and contentious relationship with the Wamapoke tribe. It comes up every now and again. Probably the best example of it is, and the best line, one of my favorite lines of the series, is the chief Ken Hatote comes to they're throwing this big what they call harvest festival, and there is rumor that because this is on indigenous land, that there is a curse, and unless they put up a sort of like move the carnival or like put up a historical exhibit for the native tribe, that there's going to be this curse. Of course, it's all like there's no curse. No. But in one of those mockumentary like interviews, pseudo interviews, the Ken Hatote, the chief, says, if there's I know 2 things about white people: they love Rachel Ray and they're terrified of curses. And so it's so funny. And of course, like the news media goes wild and really so all the lights go out at the carnival, and what makes the lights go out is not the curse. curse, it's that there's so many news media trucks there taking up all of the generator energy, right? And so they have to like work out this like agreement where the only place with enough power in town with generators is the casino that's owned by the natives. And so there's like playing with a little bit of stereotype.
That's funny.
But it's hilarious. And so Leslie says, can you come remove the curse? And so there's this great ceremony at the end of the episode where he's got like some sort of sage that he is burning, and Kenhitote is like trying to is getting rid of the curse through this ceremony. And there's dialogue, they are doing the like captions over, like the translation captions over, and he is saying, I'm just speaking nonsense right now. They have no idea what I'm saying. Doobie doobie doo. And so what's so funny is, and what makes that so interesting is, I mean, again, plays with stereotypes in some ways that can be uncomfortable at times, but the humor's at the expense of, the white folks who are scared of the curses and like, and so that I think is, and I talk about this in the book, I think is the most interesting example, oftentimes because we don't like to acknowledge that everywhere we live, for the most part in the United States, was occupied by indigenous tribes before white settlers arrived. So it's doing some interesting stuff with that. Yeah.
Yeah, that all sounds really interesting.
And it's funny, and that's the thing. And I think that's what's so great about comedy is like when I'm explaining it, it sounds probably like I'm moralizing a little bit, or like, but the show itself is so funny and engages with it in such a funny way. Yeah.
It sounds like, sitcoms in this way can make topics accessible.
Yes.
And okay to laugh about, and to maybe introduce some conversation or a perspective that you might not have considered before, but in a safer way. Is that fair to say?
I think that is spot on. And I think sitcoms have been doing that for so long. I do that in my media analysis classes when I teach at Missouri State. I almost exclusively show comedies, because when we talk about things that are a little bit heavier to deal with, and it's fine to laugh at yourself and it's fine to poke fun, like it's just sort of like thinking through what these things mean, who we're laughing at, whose stories we're telling, and the complicated way that gives us some insight into, as we talked about at the beginning of the interview, a cultural forum of, allowing us to delve into some of those tougher topics. I think comedy is perfect for that. It's perfect for it. And I think that's what's so lovely about Parks in particular, especially related to politics. Like, we live in a deeply, deeply divided time. And both Leslie and Ron, who are diametrically opposed to the role of government, are, as I mentioned a second ago, totally absurd. They do things that it's like no reasonable, rational person.
Right.
That should they do that? And they're coming from both sides of the aisle. And I mean, there are all sorts of ways to talk about that, but I think that that's something that it's doing really, really well. And I think it's why it's been such, I think it's been, it can be enjoyed by anybody.
Yeah. Wow, that sounds really fascinating. So
cool.
Well, thank you so much again. That wraps up our author talk. Holly, your book just sounds so interesting both for fans of Parks and Recreation, and then people who might be interested in television history, who just kind of want to see where our culture is. It just sounds great. So thank you again for joining us for this discussion. We really appreciated having you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.